In the spring of 2023, a trail camera mounted on a fence post at the edge of a soybean field in Barber County, Kansas, captured something that wildlife biologists in the state described, with careful professional restraint, as unexpected. The image showed a black bear, not a large one, a subadult, probably a male in his second or third year, moving through a landscape of rolling short-grass prairie and agricultural land in the south-central portion of a state that, by every conventional measure of wildlife distribution science, should not have had a bear in it at all. The Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks noted the sighting. They recorded it. They cross-referenced it against the sparse but growing file of similar reports that had been accumulating from that region and from 2 neighboring counties. And then they issued a statement that was factual, measured, and deeply interesting to anyone who pays close attention to what is happening at the edges of large carnivore range in the continental United States. Bears, they confirmed, had been documented in 3 Kansas counties. Not one isolated wanderer crossing a border and turning back. 3 counties, multiple confirmed individuals. A pattern with enough geographic coherence to constitute something more than statistical noise in the movement data of a species that has spent the better part of a century absent from that landscape. If you pay attention to stories like this one, consider staying with this to the end, because what is happening in Kansas is not simply a story about bears moving north. It is a story about what happens when the assumptions built into a century of wildlife management begin to encounter biological reality, and when the maps that define where animals are supposed to be start to diverge from where animals actually are. The baseline fact deserves to be established clearly because it is the foundation on which everything else rests. Kansas has no historical black bear population. That statement is not a casual assertion. It reflects the documented record of wildlife surveys, trapping records, settlement-era accounts, and indigenous ecological knowledge compiled across more than 2 centuries of recorded observation in the region. The last period during which black bears were a meaningful ecological presence on the Great Plains of what is now Kansas likely predates European settlement by enough time that the species had effectively, functionally vanished from the state before systematic wildlife observation began. The historical range maps that wildlife biologists use as their baseline reference for Ursus americanus, the American black bear, do not include Kansas. They include the forested Ozark regions of Missouri to the east. They include the mountainous terrain of Colorado to the west. They include the wooded river systems of Oklahoma to the south. Kansas, sitting between these regions in a landscape defined by open prairie, agricultural conversion, and the absence of the dense forest cover that black bears have historically preferred, occupies a gap. A biological gap that the species' own ecology appeared to enforce. Bears need forest. Kansas does not have much of it. Therefore, Kansas does not have bears. That was the model. That was the assumption. And that assumption is now encountering a reality that it did not predict and does not fully explain. The 3 counties where bears have been confirmed are not randomly distributed across the state. Barber County sits in the south-central region along the Oklahoma border. Comanche County, immediately to its west, is the second confirmed location. Harper County, to the east of Barber, is the third. All 3 counties share a geographic relationship with the Cimarron River drainage system and with the broken terrain of the Red Hills, a region of red clay soil, cedar breaks, and dissected river valleys that provides substantially more cover than the open plains to the north. The Oklahoma border runs along the southern edge of all 3 counties. That border is not a biological barrier of any kind. It is a line on a map. Bears moving north out of Oklahoma's established population zones in the Ouachita Mountains, the Ozark National Forest regions, and the steadily expanding black bear territory in the northeastern and north-central parts of the state cross that border without reference to its existence. What they encounter on the Kansas side of the line has historically been inhospitable enough that they turned back, dispersed east or west, or were removed before establishing themselves. Something about that dynamic has changed. Understanding what has changed requires understanding what was there in the first place, specifically what is happening with Oklahoma's black bear population, because the bears showing up in Kansas are not spontaneously generating from the Kansas landscape. They are coming from somewhere, and the most parsimonious explanation, the one supported by the directional movement data and the geographic distribution of sightings, is that they are coming from Oklahoma's expanding and increasingly dense black bear population in the southeastern and south-central regions of that state. Oklahoma's black bear story is one of the more remarkable wildlife recovery narratives in the central United States, and it has received a fraction of the attention it deserves relative to the more photogenic megafauna recovery stories in the Mountain West. The black bear population in Oklahoma's Ouachita Mountains region was functionally eliminated by the early 20th century through a combination of unregulated hunting, habitat loss, and the deliberate predator removal campaigns that characterized wildlife management across the American continent during that era. The species was reintroduced into the Ouachita National Forest in Arkansas and Oklahoma, beginning in 1958 and continuing through the early 1970s, with animals transplanted from Minnesota. That reintroduction succeeded. It succeeded beyond what the managers of that era anticipated. The bears established themselves, reproduced, and then did what recovered bear populations do in the absence of significant mortality pressure. They expanded their range. The expansion has been moving in multiple directions simultaneously, but the northward vector into Oklahoma's south-central counties is the one that matters for what is now being documented across the Kansas state line. Oklahoma's Game Management Division has tracked a steady increase in both bear sightings and documented bear mortality in counties progressively further north of the original reintroduction zone over the past 2 decades. Bears have been documented in the Cross Timbers region of central Oklahoma. They have been recorded in the grassland cedar mosaic counties of the south-central part of the state. Each successive range expansion northward in Oklahoma represents a stepping stone closer to the Kansas border, and more importantly, represents a demonstration that the species can function in landscapes progressively less forested than the Ouachita core. The bears moving into south-central Kansas are not animals that require closed canopy forest to persist. They are animals that have already demonstrated, through their occupation of mixed grass and cedar brake habitat in central Oklahoma, that their ecological flexibility is greater than the historical range models assumed. This is the ecological reality that the discovery in Kansas is making visible in a way that is important to understand clearly. The historical range models for black bears in the interior of North America were built, largely, from absence data. Bears were not in a place, therefore that place was not bear habitat. That logical structure, which has been the operational foundation of wildlife management planning for decades, works adequately when populations are stable and when the absence reflects an equilibrium between what animals need and what the landscape provides. It works less well when the absence reflects not an ecological impossibility, but a historical extirpation, followed by a long enough recovery interval that the species' actual habitat envelope has not been empirically tested against the modern landscape. The black bear's true habitat envelope in the interior of North America, meaning the set of landscape conditions under which it can actually persist and reproduce, may be substantially broader than the range maps built from post-extirpation absence data suggest. The Kansas sightings are providing a live test of that envelope. The results so far are surprising the people who built the models. The bears confirmed in Barber, Comanche, and Harper counties are navigating a landscape that does not look like bear habitat in any conventional depiction of the species' ecology. The terrain is characterized by short grass and mixed grass prairie, red clay soil formations broken by the drainage channels of the Cimarron and its tributaries, scattered stands of eastern red cedar that have expanded dramatically across the region over the past century due to fire suppression and altered grazing patterns, and extensive agricultural land planted primarily in wheat and grain sorghum. There is no contiguous forest cover. There are no mountain slopes. There is no structural habitat element that a wildlife manager trained on the standard bear ecology literature would point to as essential for the species' long-term persistence. And yet the bears are there, moving through it, feeding in it, apparently surviving in it long enough to be detected repeatedly across multiple counties and multiple seasons. The cedar expansion story embedded in this landscape description is worth pausing on because it is not incidental to the bear question. Eastern red cedar has been expanding across the Great Plains at a rate that ecologists describe as one of the most significant ongoing vegetative changes in the region. Fire suppression eliminated the low-intensity ground fires that historically limited cedar encroachment onto the grasslands. Changed grazing patterns removed a second check on woody vegetation spread. The result over the past century has been a progressive conversion of open grassland to cedar scrub across millions of acres of Kansas, Oklahoma, and the surrounding states. Wildlife managers and conservationists concerned about grassland bird species have focused on this conversion as a catastrophic habitat loss event for native prairie fauna. From the perspective of a black bear reading the landscape for cover, denning sites, and movement corridors, the same conversion represents something different. Cedar thickets provide thermal cover. They provide concealment. They provide a structural complexity that open grassland does not. The inadvertent creation of cedar scrub across the southern Kansas landscape has, in effect, been building a set of habitat elements that make the region more traversable and potentially more habitable for black bears than it was a century ago, independent of any intentional wildlife management decision. The food resource question is equally important and equally counterintuitive. Black bears are dietary generalists of the highest order. Their reputation as forest animals rests partly on the fact that forested ecosystems in the eastern and western United States provide the berry crops, mast production, and insect biomass that constitutes their preferred diet. But black bears will eat almost anything, and the agricultural landscape of south-central Kansas provides caloric opportunities that a strictly forest ecology framing would not predict. Wheat fields in the early green stage provide a high-protein forage opportunity. Grain sorghum fields are extraordinarily energy-dense food sources for a large omnivore. Beehives, which are present in significant density across the agricultural counties of south-central Kansas, are among the highest calorie-concentrated food sources available to any North American mammal, and are a documented attractant for bears across their entire range. Livestock mortality, road-killed deer, and the garbage and compost sources that accompany any rural human community round out a food landscape that is not structurally identical to what bears access in forested mountain terrain, but that is, in caloric terms, potentially adequate or better for an animal with a sufficiently flexible feeding strategy. The dispersal mechanism that is moving bears into Kansas from the Oklahoma population zones is, almost certainly, young males. This is not speculation about this specific case. It is one of the most robust findings in the black bear ecology literature across the entire range of the species. Young male black bears disperse from their natal areas at the age of 1 to 2 years, when their mothers exclude them from their home ranges in preparation for the next breeding cycle. The dispersal distances achieved by these young males are extraordinary by most mammalian standards. Documented dispersal events for male black bears include movements of 200, 300, and occasionally more than 400 miles from the natal area before the animal either establishes a home range or is removed by mortality. These are not purposeful migrations toward a predetermined destination. They are the behavioral expression of a drive to move that the animals appear to experience as aversion to conspecific proximity and as an orientation toward novel terrain. They follow topographic and vegetative corridors when those exist. They cross open terrain when corridors are not available. They are not deterred by the absence of forest from their path in the way that a landscape-level habitat model would predict, because their individual motivation is to put distance between themselves and a territorial adult male, and that motivation does not consult the habitat suitability maps. The young males dispersing north out of Oklahoma's expanding bear population are following river systems where those provide structure. The Cimarron drainage runs roughly east to west through the northern Oklahoma and southern Kansas landscape and provides a vegetated corridor that reduces the exposure of a moving bear to open terrain. The red cedar thickets along that drainage amplify the cover available. The agricultural resources on either side of the drainage provide the food that sustains movement. The result is a landscape that, whatever its formal categorization in the wildlife management literature, is functioning as a dispersal conduit for bears moving north. The 3 Kansas counties where bears have been confirmed all sit within or adjacent to the Cimarron drainage system. This is not a coincidence. What is genuinely uncertain, and what makes the Kansas situation more than a simple dispersal story, is whether what is being observed represents occasional transient individuals moving through and eventually moving back south or dying, or whether it represents the beginning of a permanent range expansion into a landscape that will sustain breeding bears over multiple generations. The distinction matters enormously for how wildlife managers should respond, for how agricultural and rural communities in the affected counties should prepare, and for how the broader public understands what is happening. Transient dispersers are a known phenomenon in black bear biology and do not, by themselves, indicate a range shift. They pass through, sometimes cause localized livestock or property incidents, and then either leave or are removed by management action. They do not constitute a population. If what is moving through Barber, Comanche, and Harper counties is a steady stream of young dispersing males, with no females following behind them and no reproduction occurring, then the situation is notable as an indicator of Oklahoma population density, but does not represent the establishment of bears in Kansas in any ecologically meaningful sense. The female question is therefore the central biological variable in assessing what the Kansas sightings mean for the long term. Female black bears are philopatric to a degree that makes their dispersal patterns fundamentally different from males. They establish home ranges in proximity to their mother's ranges. They are the demographic anchor of a bear population. Without females, a landscape full of transient males is not a bear habitat. It is a corridor that bears move through. The documented sightings in Kansas so far have not, as of the confirmed reports available to the public, included confirmed identification of females or cubs. This is not evidence that no females are present. It is evidence that the current documentation effort has not confirmed them. Trail cameras and incidental sightings are not a systematic population survey. The absence of confirmed females in the current record is a data gap, not a biological conclusion. Wildlife managers at the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks are aware of this distinction and have been explicit about the uncertainty it creates. Their public communications have been careful to describe what has been confirmed, individual bears in specific locations, without drawing conclusions about population establishment that the data does not yet support. This is appropriate scientific caution. It is also, if the trend continues and females begin appearing in the Kansas record, a posture that will require revision. The timeline for that revision, if it comes, is not predictable from the current data, but the directional indicators in the Oklahoma population data, the continued northward expansion of bears in that state, the increasing frequency of sightings in the Kansas border counties, and the apparent adequacy of the landscape for at least short-term occupancy all point toward a situation that wildlife managers in Kansas are likely to be revisiting at more frequent intervals than was the norm 5 years ago. The landowner dimension of this situation is the one most immediately and practically consequential for the people who actually live in Barber, Comanche, and Harper counties, and it is the dimension that the wildlife management system is least well equipped to address in real time. Kansas has no established regulatory framework for black bear management. It has no hunting season for bears because there has been no population to manage. It has no livestock depredation compensation program for bear damage because bear damage was not a recognized category of wildlife conflict in the state. It has no public communication infrastructure for teaching rural landowners and agricultural operators how to manage attractants, how to respond to bear encounters, how to protect livestock operations from a predator that has not historically been part of their landscape experience. All of these infrastructure elements exist in states with established bear populations. None of them exist in Kansas. The bears moving into the state are arriving into a management vacuum that the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks will need to address, and the speed with which that address happens will have real consequences for both the bears and the human communities sharing their space. The attractant management question is particularly urgent because south-central Kansas is, as noted, a landscape with abundant high-calorie resources that bears will exploit with the opportunistic efficiency that defines the species. Beehives are among the most consistent bear attractants documented across the range of black bears, and the south-central Kansas region has a significant apiary industry. A bear that learns that beehives contain honey and beeswax is a bear that will return to that location and that will travel to find additional hive sites. The livestock mortality and carrion resources on cattle operations in the region are similarly attractive. Grain storage facilities near the field edge represent a concentrated caloric opportunity that a bear will remember and revisit. All of these are problems that rural communities in bear country have developed practical mitigation strategies for, over decades of experience with the species. Electric fence configurations that protect beehives from bears are well established and highly effective. Securing livestock mortality before it becomes accessible to scavenging bears is standard practice in bear country. Grain storage protocols that limit accessibility are routinely used in states where bears are established agricultural neighbors. None of this knowledge is esoteric. It is transferable. The question is whether the knowledge transfer happens proactively, before conflicts accumulate and attitudes harden, or reactively, after a pattern of damage incidents has generated a community response that is difficult to walk back. The reactive scenario is worth describing explicitly, because it is the more common historical pattern, and its consequences for bear populations have been severe. When a predator or large omnivore that has not previously been part of a rural community's experience begins causing livestock or property damage in that community, the initial response is frequently individual and extra-legal. Animals that have never been considered a management problem, for which no reporting system exists and no response infrastructure is in place, are dealt with by the people experiencing the damage in the most direct way available to them. In rural agricultural communities, with high rates of firearm ownership and a strong cultural tradition of individual problem resolution with wildlife, that means shooting. Bears killed by landowners in response to livestock or property damage in states without bear management frameworks occupy a legal gray area that is not consistently enforced and that is rarely counted in any official mortality record. The documented mortality of bears in Kansas, if it is occurring at any meaningful rate, is almost certainly underreported in the official record for precisely this reason. The animals are present. The management framework is not. And the gap between those two facts is being filled, in the quietest possible way by individual decisions that the public record does not capture. This is not a condemnation of rural landowners or agricultural operators. It is a description of a predictable outcome when wildlife management fails to keep pace with wildlife range dynamics. People experiencing damage from an animal for which there is no official response mechanism, no compensation program, and no management infrastructure are not behaving irrationally when they resolve the problem through the means available to them. They are behaving exactly as people in their position have behaved, in response to every analogous wildlife conflict situation in the historical record. The responsibility for creating the conditions that produce this outcome rests with the management system, specifically with its failure to anticipate and respond to range expansion events in real time, rather than waiting for population establishment to become undeniable before developing the regulatory and outreach infrastructure that would have been better built earlier. The public awareness dimension of the Kansas bear situation has its own dynamic that is worth examining separately. Rural communities in Barber, Comanche, and Harper counties are not, for the most part, composed of people who are unfamiliar with wildlife. These are communities where hunting is a significant cultural practice, where agricultural operations require daily engagement with the natural world, and where the fauna of the regional landscape is not abstract but immediate. But bear is not part of that experiential framework in south-central Kansas. The animal, its behavior, its capabilities, its danger profile, and its management requirements are outside the practical knowledge base that rural Kansans have developed through generations of lived experience with the species assemblage of their region. A farmer in the Oklahoma, Ouachita foothills who has grown up with bears as a persistent presence in the landscape has a practical working knowledge of the species that shapes how he interprets bear sign, responds to bear encounters, and manages his operation to minimize conflict. A wheat farmer in Barber County who has never seen a bear in 30 years of farming the same ground does not have that knowledge. He has, at most, the generalized cultural awareness of bears as a category, which is informed largely by television and by the accumulated mythology of a species that is simultaneously feared and beloved in American popular culture in ways that are not particularly useful for practical encounter management. This knowledge gap has real consequences. A person who does not know that running from a bear can trigger pursuit, that making eye contact and speaking calmly is more effective than fleeing, that a bear standing on its hind legs is typically curious rather than aggressive, and that a black bear demonstrating bluff charges can usually be deterred by standing one's ground and making noise is less safe in a bear encounter than a person who knows these things. This is not about intelligence or competence. It is about species-specific knowledge that is only acquired through proximity to the species and that south-central Kansas residents have had no reason to acquire until now. The extension of that knowledge into communities that are now, for the first time in living memory, sharing their landscape with a large omnivore, is a practical public safety task that should be underway now, not after an incident creates urgency. The hunting regulation question is one that the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks will be unable to avoid indefinitely if the bear presence in the state becomes more established. Bear hunting in the states surrounding Kansas is a regulated activity that serves both conservation and conflict management functions. Oklahoma has a limited bear hunting season that has been carefully structured to avoid undermining the recovering population while providing some harvest opportunity and, importantly, maintaining the population's wariness of humans. Missouri manages a bear season in the Ozark population. Colorado, to the west, has one of the more intensively managed bear hunting programs in the United States. Kansas has no such program because Kansas has had no bears to manage. If bears establish themselves in the state to the point that a resident population is recognized, The question of whether and how to manage harvest will become politically contentious in a way that wildlife managers would prefer to get ahead of, rather than respond to reactively. Bear hunting is among the more politically charged wildlife management topics in the United States, and the political geography of the debate does not map neatly onto traditional partisan lines. Opposition to bear hunting in states with established populations has come from both urban conservation advocates and, in some cases, from rural communities experiencing human-bear conflict who favor lethal removal of problem individuals by wildlife managers over a general hunting season. Support for bear hunting has come from hunting heritage communities and from wildlife managers who see regulated harvest as the most practical tool for maintaining the behavioral wariness of bears toward humans that is the most important factor in keeping conflict rates low. The debate in Kansas, when it comes, will be complicated by the fact that the state has no institutional memory of managing bears, no established advocacy community on either side that has developed the detailed policy positions that come from years of engagement with a specific management question, and no public cultural relationship with the species that would shape the debate in the way that long coexistence states like Michigan or Minnesota bring to their bear management discussions. What the rest of the country should understand about what is happening in Kansas is that it is not an isolated anomaly. It is one node in a continental scale pattern of large mammal range dynamics that has been accelerating over the past 2 decades, and that is producing confirmed presences of multiple species in areas that their historical range maps define as outside their distribution. The black bear is, in this context, one of the more ecologically flexible and demographically robust examples of a broader phenomenon. Mountain lions have been confirmed in multiple Midwestern states with no historical population over the past 15 years. Wolves have dispersed into California, Colorado, and the northern Rockies states in ways that the recovery models of 20 years ago did not project at this pace. White-tailed deer have expanded their range northward into areas that 50 years ago were considered marginal winter habitat, driven partly by climate-related changes in snow depth and duration. Coyotes have expanded across virtually the entire continental United States and into urban cores that no wildlife manager of the mid-20th century would have predicted as coyote habitat. The common thread running through all of these range dynamics is the interaction between recovering populations, whose density in core habitat zones has been increasing as management has improved, and landscapes that have been changing in ways that make them more traversable and sometimes more habitable for large mammals than they were at the historical baseline. Fire suppression has thickened vegetation across grassland margins. Agricultural landscapes have become more food-rich for generalist omnivores. Rural human density has declined in many regions, reducing the mortality pressure on dispersing animals. And the legal framework that governed wildlife management through the mid-20th century, which generally treated large predators and omnivores as problems to be controlled rather than populations to be managed, has been progressively replaced by a system that extends legal protection to recovering species and limits the unregulated take that historically truncated dispersal events before they could result in range expansion. The result is a continent where the wildlife distribution maps of 50 years ago are increasingly inaccurate as descriptions of where animals actually are. The gap between the historical range model and the current biological reality is widest for the species with the greatest ecological flexibility and the most robust population recoveries. Black bears sit near the top of that list. They have recovered dramatically from their mid-20th century lows across the eastern United States and are now, in many regions, pressing against habitat boundaries that were treated as limits but are proving to be more permeable than the models suggested. Kansas is one location where that permeability is becoming documented and confirmed in a way that demands a response from a wildlife management system that was not designed with this scenario in mind. There is a dimension of this story that the institutional language of wildlife management tends to understate, and that is the dimension of ecological meaning. The return of a large omnivore to a landscape from which it has been absent for generations is not simply a management problem or a public safety consideration or a legal question about harvest regulation. It is an ecological event of genuine significance. Black bears, as they function in the ecosystems where they are established, are agents of seed dispersal, of soil disturbance, of energy transfer between forest and meadow, of the kind of messy, non-linear ecological process that produces the complexity and resilience that distinguishes functioning ecosystems from degraded ones. Their absence from a landscape is not ecologically neutral. Their return is not ecologically neutral either. The southern Kansas landscape, shaped by a century of fire suppression, agricultural conversion, and the loss of essentially all of the large mammal fauna that characterized the pre-Columbian southern plains, is an ecologically impoverished system by any functional measure. The arrival of bears does not restore it. Nothing arriving now restores what was there before, but it adds a functional element that has been missing. And that addition has cascading effects on the behavior of other species and on the processes that structure the landscape. The reaction that the Kansas bear story has generated in the broader public, insofar as it has generated one, has split along lines that are entirely predictable and that reflect the broader polarization of wildlife management as a policy domain. The response that emphasizes the positive conservation valence of the story, the bears are coming back, recovery is happening, the land is healing, has been dominant in the environmental media and in the social media ecosystems of conservation advocacy communities. The response that emphasizes the management challenges, the conflict potential, the absence of regulatory infrastructure, and the interests of agricultural landowners has been dominant in rural media and in the communications of farming and ranching advocacy organizations. Both responses contain genuine truth. Neither captures the full picture. The full picture is more complex and more interesting than either the recovery narrative or the conflict narrative alone, because it involves a biological process that does not consult the preference systems of the humans who have strong opinions about its outcome. The agricultural community's concerns are legitimate and deserve to be taken seriously in the wildlife management response, rather than dismissed as ideological resistance to conservation. Cattle operations in Barber and Comanche counties are family businesses operating on margins that do not absorb uncovered losses easily. A bear that develops a pattern of killing calves or yearling cattle on a specific operation is not a theoretical problem. It is a financial injury that compounds over a season into something that affects the viability of the operation and the family it supports. The absence of a compensation mechanism in Kansas for bear depredation losses is a real policy gap that creates real incentives for the informal resolution of bear problems that the documented record of predator expansion across the country shows leads to unreported mortality and management opacity. Building a compensation framework before the conflict becomes acute, rather than after, is both better policy and better conservation practice. It is also the approach that tends to produce better long-term outcomes for coexistence in states that have tried both strategies. The conservation community's enthusiasm about the Kansas bear story is also legitimate and worth preserving against the management challenges that will inevitably shape the political conversation about the animals as they become more established. The black bear's range expansion into the southern Great Plains, if it is confirmed and sustained, represents a genuine ecological recovery event in a region that has few of them to celebrate. The southern plains have lost more of their native large mammal fauna than almost any comparable area region in North America. The bison, the wolves, the grizzly bears, the jaguars, the pronghorn that historically defined the mammal community of the southern plains are functionally gone from that landscape. Nothing is replacing them in their original ecological roles. The black bear's arrival is not a restoration of what was lost, because bears were not, in the period of heaviest ecological disruption, a major faunal element of the open plains. But it is the arrival of a large mammal that performs real ecological functions and that represents the return of a category of animal that the landscape has been without for long enough that its presence again would register as biologically meaningful. What should happen next, in the practical and policy sense, is not complicated to describe, even if it is complicated to execute in the political environment of a state with no institutional infrastructure for the task. The Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks needs to accelerate its monitoring effort to determine whether what is present in the 3 confirmed counties includes females, whether any reproduction is occurring, and whether the pattern of occupancy is transient or establishing toward permanence. That determination should drive the pace of regulatory and outreach development, but the development should not wait for definitive confirmation, because the lead time required to build functional management infrastructure means that waiting for certainty before beginning development guarantees that the management response will lag the biological reality by several years. The outreach effort to agricultural communities in the affected counties should begin immediately, with practical, specific guidance on attractant management, livestock protection, and encounter response that is grounded in the decades of practical knowledge accumulated in states that have been living with bears for generations. The compensation and conflict response framework should be drafted now, before any notable conflict occurs, so that it is available to deploy rather than being designed in the middle of a conflict situation that creates urgency and distorts deliberation. The broader lesson that the Kansas situation offers to the national conversation about large carnivore and large omnivore management in the United States is a lesson about the reliability of historical range models as guides to future management planning. The models have been wrong, not because they were built without care or expertise, but because they were built on data that reflected a historically unusual low point in large mammal populations and range extent, and because they embedded that low point as a baseline rather than recognizing it as an artifact of a specific period of management and cultural history. The animals themselves, given the opportunity of recovering populations and the stimulus of landscapes that have changed in ways that make them more navigable, are demonstrating the limits of those models by simply going where the models say they should not be. Bears in counties with no historical bear population are one manifestation of that demonstration. They are not the only one, and the wildlife management system's ability to respond effectively to the others depends partly on how honestly and rapidly it can revise its assumptions in the face of the biological reality that trail cameras in Barber County and soybean fields along the Cimarron drainage are documenting, one image at a time. The trail camera image from that fence post in spring of 2023 will not be the last unexpected image from south-central Kansas. The question is, what kind of infrastructure, intellectual, regulatory, practical, and relational, is in place when the next one arrives? Bears do not consult management plans. They do not check range maps before they move. They follow food and safety and the ancient dispersal imperatives of their own biology across landscapes that human categories say they should not occupy, and they arrive in places that are not prepared for them and that must now figure out what to do. The 3 Kansas counties with confirmed bears are at the beginning of that figuring out process. How it unfolds will depend on decisions made by wildlife managers who are working without a playbook, by landowners who are encountering an animal outside their experience, by policymakers who are being asked to build regulatory infrastructure for a situation that their constituents did not know was coming, and by a broader public that is still making sense of what the bear in the soybean field means for how they think about the prairie landscape and what belongs in it. The meaning is not simple. It is not simply a conservation success, or simply a management challenge, or simply a harbinger of human-wildlife conflict, or simply a proof of ecological resilience. It is all of those things operating simultaneously, in a landscape that is itself, in the middle of a long and incomplete transition, whose direction is not fully determined by the choices being made right now, but that is being shaped by them in ways that will be visible to the people who come after. The bear in the trail camera image is doing what it has always done. It is moving across a landscape, looking for food, assessing cover, following the biological imperatives of its species with no awareness that its presence is unexpected, or that the image it left behind would matter to people trying to understand what is happening to the living world at the edge of the American plains. What matters is that the image exists, that it is confirmed, that there are 3 counties in a state that should not have bears where bears are now being documented with enough regularity and geographic coherence to constitute a pattern, and that the pattern is the beginning of something, not the end. Whether that something develops into established population or reverts to occasional transient presence, whether it is met with management competence or policy vacuum, whether it becomes a story of successful coexistence or of conflict managed badly, will be determined not by the bears but by the humans on the other side of the camera. That has always been the case with wildlife recovery in this country. The animals do their part when the conditions allow it. The rest is up to the people making decisions about what kind of landscape they want to inhabit and who they are willing to share it with. The bears in Barber, Comanche, and Harper counties have already answered that question from their end. The trail camera recorded the answer. Kansas is still working out its own.